Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this another valuable Power Retail webinar session. So my name is Grant Arnott. I'm the publisher of Power Retail, and I'll be introducing our guest speaker very shortly. But before the introduction, just some quick housekeeping. Firstly, the bathrooms. I hope you know where they are because this is a webinar and I'm not going to be able to help you. Mobile phones, turn them to silent. I can't ridicule you if it goes off because I won't hear it. That's beside the point. You want to pay attention because this is going to be a great session. And we've got a huge presentation ahead this morning, so please get comfortable. Australian consumers have embraced a wider array of methods for shopping and purchasing than ever before. Research commissioned by Bronto Software, however, shows that Australian consumers are still largely making purchases on laptops and desktops rather than mobile devices. Commerce marketers must create a seamless, frictionless experience regardless of where or when the multi-device, omni-channel consumer chooses to shop. Bronto commissioned a survey of 1,000 Australian adults to learn more about the influence of device ownership and use on the shopping behaviour of Australian consumers. And now, Bronto's Vice President of Marketing, Susan Wall, will share details from the survey that will help you create a seamless experience across devices and channels. So please give a welcome to Susan Wall. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Grant. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks very much to Power Retail. We really appreciate you allowing us to share some exciting new research, as Grant mentioned. You may know Bronto Software. We focus on commerce marketing. That is, helping all of you who are focused on driving consumer sales through the internet and other online activities. And with this focus, one of the things we at Bronto try to do is really understand as much as we can about how consumers shop and buy and how those activities are changing. Because what we want to do is understand with you what you need to do to be successful and how we can help you be successful. So one of the things that we've done in recent years is to begin undertaking research to really understand the consumer and what's going on for them. We've undertaken now some original research in Australia, as well as the US and the UK. And our goal here with this particular piece of research was to understand the role of the various devices that all of us could be using for shopping and purchase. And so that was really what we wanted to accomplish. So now, let me tell you a little bit about the study that we undertook. So in Australia, we commissioned Ipsos Research to conduct a survey among consumers who owned or had access to at least one of the following 5 devices: a desktop, a laptop, a tablet, a smartphone, and or a wearable. And by wearables, we mean things like the Apple Watch. The data that we're going to report from this study comes from that research, and we're going to tell you about things that are significantly different. So we do check and make sure that we're not telling you about things that are really minor, but they do pass a test for statistical significance. And we're going to bring those kind of things to your attention. Now, the data that I'm going to share in this study comes from these 1,000 Australian adults, and that's primarily the data you're going to see. Where we have some applicable and interesting data from either the UK or the US for comparisons, we'll specifically add that in and identify it for you. So if you don't see a country identified, then you should assume that this is Australian research. Now, our goal with this presentation today and doing this research is not just to share it, but to also share some recommendations of what you should do given the results that we have seen. So let's really go into the results now and start to look at this data. Now, the first thing that we learned is that on average, adults in Australia own about 3 of these devices. So that's 3 out of the 5 devices. It's actually 2.9 exactly. What you see here in this chart is the device ownership is in blue, shopping is in red, and purchase is in green. And that's a color scheme we'll keep often during, I think, throughout this entire presentation. Now, what you notice as you look at this simple bar chart is that shopping and purchase is done on 1.6 devices on average. So what we see is that people have many more devices than they are currently using for shopping and purchase in Australia. Now, if we start to look at device ownership by some of the demographics, the key one that really came out for us was household income. And it's really not a big surprise that we discovered that the number of devices that one owns goes up as your household income goes up. That's what we would expect. You have more disposable income in a household that has a higher income average, and therefore you can afford more of these devices. So now if you look here, you'll see that those with household incomes of under 40,000 typically own 2.7 of these devices. If you're in the 40 to 80,000 household income range, then you typically own 2.9. So a little bit above that for the lowest group. Now you see the jump really happens at this next level. When you go up to the people who are 80 to 120,000 or over 120,000, you see they're almost identical at about 3.5 devices. So one of the things that you want to think about as you go through this research is think about your own target audience. Who are they, and are there demographic characteristics that you need to pay attention to? So if you're on the higher income, if your target audience is in the higher income brackets, then you need to recognize that they have more devices and they're using more devices. And so you have to be able to respond to that more quickly than someone who is targeting people with lower household incomes. Now, in this chart, we compare the Australian consumer population with those of the US and the UK. On the left for ownership and on the right for purchases. So Australia's in blue, UK's in red, and US is in green. And what you see is that the US is slightly ahead of Australia, which is slightly ahead of the UK in terms of number of devices owned by a person. When you get over to purchases, you see that again, the US is slightly ahead. They're using more of those devices. They're not using all of them. Nowhere did we find that, but you see that they are using slightly more. And the UK and the US and Australia rather are the same, each using on average about 1.6 devices for actually purchasing purposes. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at next was device ownership and then shopping and purchase patterns. So we've looked at the devices in the previous slides. We talked about devices as a group. So now what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at them individually. And so exactly which devices do Aussies own and use? And so here you see the 5 different devices we've measured. Starting on the left, the blue bar is ownership. Smartphones lead the pack. At 88% of Australian adults own a smartphone. It's a very high percentage. Next comes laptops with 77%. Then desktops at 62%. Tablets are just over half at 54%. And then you see the wearables are just beginning to come into the market in Australia. They're only at 6% right now in terms of the Australian market. Now, when you turn to the shopping and the purchase behavior, you see a quite different pattern. So now I'm looking at the red bars for the shopping and the green bars for the purchasing. Let's go back to those smartphones, so all the way on the left. What you see is even though the smartphones are the thing that most people own, that is not what they're using for shopping and purchasing. Only around 1/3 of the people, the Australian population, uses a smartphone for shopping or for purchase. If you move next over to the laptops, you'll see that the laptop is the most popular device for shopping and purchasing purposes, followed closely behind by the desktop. So laptops at 58% shopping and purchase, and desktops around 50% for shopping and purchase. Tablets, again, lag far behind. They're owned by half of the population, but only about a fifth of the population actually uses them in shopping and purchasing. So what we've learned is that fewer people are shopping and buying yet on the mobile devices. So if you have a target, if you are looking at your commerce website, you need to think about which devices does it work well on. Probably most of you began by optimizing your commerce websites for the laptop and the desktop. And it seems that if for most of you, that's probably still fairly safe, although it's starting to move into the mobile areas. So you got to start to look at the mobile devices and think about how your shopping website plays on those mobile devices. Depending upon the segment of the audience that you target, that might be a little more urgent need than some of the other segments, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now what we want to do is look at age breaks by each of these devices. And so again, they're in the same order. The smartphone is on the left. And the thing that really surprised me as a researcher was the smartphone dominance in 5 of the 6 age groups, over 90%. We just don't see over 90% of a population doing anything. So that is amazing that it is almost universally owned by people who are between 18 and 64. You only see the drop-off when you hit that 65 plus group, who are only at 50%, but 59%, I'm sorry. But again, that's over half of the 65 have a smartphone as well. Now, if we move to the laptops, you see that of the youngest group, 88% of them own a laptop. And then it goes down as you get older. So there is definitely a relationship there. Not surprisingly, as we move to the next group, the desktop, you see the opposite relationship is true. What you see is that as age increases, so does the likelihood that you still have a desktop. I say it that way because I posit that younger people used to have desktops and now they have gotten rid of them and moved away, and it's the older groups that are still hanging on to them. I don't have the data, but that's my hypothesis. Another interesting thing I want to point out is really about tablets. Now, when you look at tablets, one of the things that you see is that the ownership levels are highest in the middle age ranges. Now, what we've seen in other countries is that ownership, that the presence of children in the household really drives ownership of tablets. And that makes a lot of sense. They talk about how their kids use the tablets. We don't actually have the data for Australia in terms of presence of children in the household, but that would be our hypothesis, even though we don't have that data to back it up. We think that's a reasonable way to think about it. Now, the next chart, we're going to look at comparing Australia to the UK and the US in terms of ownership of these 5 devices. And there that you see, first off, again, let's go back to that smartphone. At 88% market dominance in Australia, the smartphone in Australia is more widely adopted than it is in either the UK, which is at 82%, or the US, which is at 75%. It is interesting to me because we in the US have often been told that we're behind other countries in terms of adoption of cellular technology. And here's the data that exactly backs that up, that thing that we've been told so often. Now let's take a look at laptops and desktops. Now in laptops, you see that all 3 countries are virtually even The U.S. is a little bit ahead at 80% ownership. But what I want to point out is that for the U.S., this is the highest group. So more people in the U.S. have access to a laptop versus a smartphone, while it is the reverse in both Australia and in the UK. Now, moving over to the third group, the desktops, you see again in the US, we're hanging on to our desktops. 2/3 of us still have a desktop. In Australia, that's 62%. But then in the UK, it's less than 50%. It's only 46%. Which is an interesting fact to me that they have already moved away from the desktops more so than the other two countries. Next, when we look in the tablets, we see that that's where the UK is higher than the other two countries. They have 60% of the population has a tablet versus 57 in the US and 54 in Australia. And back to the wearable market, here's where the U.S. is out. They're out, we're out trying things in the U.S. And so we have 13% market penetration of the wearable market now in the U.S. And it's obviously much less in Australia and UK for now. Okay, let's move on and let's look at another thing that was very important to us. One of the things that we heard a lot about was that the proliferation of all of these different devices was going to change how people were shopping. So we really wanted to understand that better. Is it really changing all their shopping patterns? And so in this next slide, what you see is that we ask people whether they were using each of these devices for shopping purposes more frequently, less frequently, or no difference. So let's go first to the smartphones. Although the proportion of Australian consumers using smartphones for shopping is not as high as it is in some other countries, it's clearly growing, as you see in these first three bars. 49% of the people in Australia say they are shopping online on their smartphone more often than they did a year ago. Only 9% say they're doing it less frequently, and 42% say it's no different. So a huge proportion say it's either more frequently or no different. So the smartphone, it is coming. Shopping on the smartphone is going to be coming in Australia and be a more important effect for all of you to think about. Now, the big story here is not really about the smartphone. The big story here is that online shopping is increasing dramatically on every single device. Just look at the blue bar. That's the more frequent use of that device for shopping. Every blue bar is much bigger than every red bar for these 5 devices. So we're seeing a lot more online shopping altogether. So then some people would assume that more online shopping means less shopping in physical stores. So we asked that question as well, but you can see that that's not the case. Look at those 3 bars to the far right on this chart. You'll see that nearly equal percentages of Australians say that they're shopping more frequently in stores in the past year as say they're shopping less frequently in stores. The majority say there's really no difference. So the online shopping is not having nearly the impact in the physical store shopping as people have expected it to have. So that's an important thing. If you have a bricks and mortar location, that's an important thing for you to know, that it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a trade-off. You can make those things work together for you. Another idea that we heard floating around is that young people are shopping less in our bricks and mortar locations, that they're the ones who are really preferring online shopping instead. But our research says that's not the case, certainly at least in Australia. We asked these questions, we looked at the data by age, and you see that the 18 to 24-year-olds and the 25 to 34-year-olds are are more likely to say they're shopping more frequently, not less frequently. There's still big groups who say that there's no difference. One of the things that we think may be influencing this in the stores is the very social aspect. We know that our younger folks are responding heavily to the social interactions and the social aspects, and that's what the physical store can provide for them. Going out with their friends, meeting people at a store, going shopping together, and so they have the opportunity for that. If that is the case, and that's what's bringing them in, that's one thing to think about as you think about what you want to do in your physical stores, to create an experience that is different than the experience that they're going to get online. Now, when we look at purchasing behavior, what we see is that the laptops and the desktops are still most widely used. So here we're looking at the purchasing behavior by device and by age group. And so you see how high the bars are for laptop purchasing, and you see again a little higher for the youngest group, and it sort of fades off getting to the older group. And the reverse is true on the desktop. So that matches that pattern that we had seen, where you're a little more likely to be using the desktop if you're older, more likely to be using the laptop if you're younger. Now let's go over to that smartphone. We do start to see the younger people using smartphones for purchase behavior. Over half of the people in the youngest two age groups have said they've made at least one purchase on their smartphone. What we see happening on the smartphones in particular is that people are doing one-click purchases, things that are extremely easy. Think about how Amazon has that one-click purchase set up. The reason Amazon has a one-click purchase set up is to make it easy for a smartphone. That is the total reason why they have that set up. And so you need to think about whether people can easily make a purchase on their smartphone, and how can you make it easier for them, especially if they have a repeat purchase. One of the other things that we've heard is for people who often order the same thing repeatedly, for example, they have a favorite pizza and they want to have it delivered, then they have it set up so that it's really a one-click order, because this is the same pizza I order every time I order pizza. So one of the things that I really want to suggest to people is that, you take out, wait till the webinar is over, please, but you take out your smartphone and you try to make a purchase on your own website. How easy or how hard is it to do that? So you'll need to figure out whether your audience is there today and trying to make purchases, or they will be moving there in the coming years and the coming months. And so when do you need to be ready for that move, or do you already need to be ready? So our next slide here just really shows you in a very broad basis, if you're thinking about groups and who you need to be prepared for as you're preparing your site. If your audience is age 55 and plus, then they're predominantly using desktop for making purchases. And so you have time, as long as you have the desktop set up, you have time before you have to worry about the mobile devices. If your target audience is younger, 18 to 44, then you better check now whether you have a mobile device, a website that's going to work well with a mobile device. Now, one of the things that we looked at then was this income break, and we went back to household income, and we looked at how people in different household incomes were using the different devices for purchasing. And the thing that struck me as I looked at this chart is that group who is 80,000 to 120,000 household Australian dollars household income. They are purchasing more on every device just about. I mean, laptop, it's equal with the highest income group. But everywhere else, they are purchasing more. And it's interesting to me, I must confess I don't know enough about the different income groups and their characteristics in Australia, but this is an effect we have not seen in any other country. Every other country we've done this research in, we see the highest income group is doing the most purchasing on all the devices. So that's a very interesting phenomenon that we see here in Australia that you know, I quite honestly don't know how to explain. But here's another fact for you that sort of backs that up. When we look at, so how many devices are they using by purchase? You see that the 80 to 120,000 are the only group who's using over 2 devices on average. So again, if you're targeting that group or the group and the one above the higher income folks, you really need to think about what different devices they're using, because they are definitely using more than one for making purchases. So what does all of this mean? And what do we do now? Well, basically the theme that we have seen out of this research is that seamless experiences are becoming essential to people. We need to recognize that this is a multi-device world. And the real question is whether your particular target audience is already there or they're moving there in the coming months and the coming years. But it is a multi-device world. So you have to think about, what is your shopping experience, and are you providing a good shopping experience regardless of device type? Are you providing a good purchase experience regardless of device type? Because you want the person to be able to actually do what they want to do and not get interrupted. You don't want the experience on this device to be a barrier to them completing that shopping and purchase transaction. One of the other things that we have begun to see, and it's a little less true for Australia than either the US or the UK, but it is definitely coming, is that you need a more seamless flow across your devices and across your shopping sessions. One of the things that we understand from our consumers is that they actually think we're very smart. They give us a lot more credit than they should. They think that wherever they encounter us, we know them and we know it's the exact same person. So whether they are in our store, on the smartphone, on a desktop, they think we know it's the same person. Some retailers have managed now to have a fairly seamless experience so that they recognize the person that comes back. But most retailers aren't there yet. So that if I begin a shopping session on one device and I get interrupted, or I want to take a break and think about those items, I put them in my shopping cart, and then I come back to it later on another device, one of the things that happens in many retailers is that those items are no longer in my shopping cart, because my shopping cart is tied to the device that I was on, because it's not recognizing that it's the same person. And that's a problem that we are going to have to solve. I think people are a little more patient right now as we're really moving into this multi-device world, but fairly soon we're going to have to solve that so that we recognize the person and treat them the same way regardless of what device they're coming on. So that's really the extent of our research. I just wanted to say thanks to all of you for spending this time. We do have copies of both of the reports that I talked about, the one that looks just at Australia patterns and then the one that compares Australia to the UK and the US. And so if you're interested in copies, you can go to bronto.com/resources. And now I want to open it up. If there are any questions, if anyone's chatted in with questions, please, Grant, maybe you can let me know, and we'll try to see if we can answer some of those.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Susan, for an excellent presentation. Lots of great insights into our Australian market, which Australian customers are bamboozling you over there, and you can't figure them out. So we'll keep trying to do that. Look, we do have a few questions for you, and then also we probably will run out of time. But just to let everyone know, if you do have any questions and you post them, they will be answered in a follow-up from Bronto post this webinar as well. But Susan, I'll just
actually people could just if people also wanted to email me, I would be happy to try to answer them as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll pass on the email to those who've attended the webinar today, and we can certainly follow that up post-webinar. But we do have a few lined up right now. So, Susan, on one chart you talked about young people shopping more in stores. So people want to know, do you have any idea about how to make that happen?
Yes. This really gets back to the issue that we were talking about with the social experience. And in that social experience, one of the things that we've seen, I'm getting feedback right now. Can we fix that?
Sorry, is that from my end? I'll just mute myself, sorry.
Thank you. That's gone now. There, I think people will be able to hear now. So one of the things that we've seen people do very successfully with the younger groups is really focus on that social side. And, excuse me, in particular, one of the things that they have done is they have used social media as a mechanism to tie people to the store. And so they use social media to talk about events. They use social media to get some buzz going. They create an event in which the social media side of it is something that is very, very much appreciated by the younger audience. And so if you tie your store and your store experience to your social media, whatever you have found that works well for you, whether you are doing Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram, find ways to link those activities into your in-store activities, because that will drive that same group of people across those two channels. And we found that's very effective for some of the retailers. So is there another question, Grant?
Yes, there is. Sorry, Susan, I'm just jumping on and off to mute it. So someone's asked, do I need a separate website for mobile rather than desktop and laptop access? So I guess that's a question regarding the preference over an M site versus a responsive site, I'd imagine.
Well, so to begin with, that's a difficult question to answer because there's not one universal answer for everyone. It depends upon the software that you have. I know that some retailers have successfully designed two separate sites. One that really works better for smartphones and for the tablets, and another site that works better for the laptops and the desktops. To the extent that you had an audience who was not crossing those channels, that is probably an okay strategy at the moment. I think long term, however, that's not going to work. I think long term, you're going to have one site that can adapt so it is the same experience regardless of device that people are on. And so you're not going to be able to get away with designing two different sites. You're going to have a site that is responsive first, and it is designed with that in mind. And so for many retailers, that means going back and redesigning their site, because when it was designed, it was not thought of as responsive first. So you need to think about doing that. Again, to the extent that you are appealing to that younger audience, you need to get on the mark and start doing that sooner. To the extent that you're in the older age group, you might have a little more time, although it really depends. If they're higher income, older, again, you don't have quite as much time before you need to have a truly responsive website that works for everyone.
Okay, excellent. Now, just two more questions. So first one is, you mentioned age and household income differences. So was there any difference specifically between men and women that you picked up in the research?
That's an interesting question because we only saw one place in the Australian research where there was a difference between the men and women, and that was in device ownership. The men own more devices than the women do. But in Australia and the UK, there were many more differences between men and women. And those differences were most pronounced in the US. In the US, men not only own more devices, but they also use them. They do more shopping. They do more purchasing on these devices. Anything that you could imagine. They talked about, shopping more frequently. Everything. The men were doing it all first in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK. We have not yet seen that difference in Australia, but it will be interesting if we repeat this research and then see that starting to play out as well.
Excellent. And just one final one, Susan, before we have to wrap up. So I'm curious, just along the lines of what you were talking about with the mobile devices before. A lot of our readers in Australia and a lot of our retail businesses in Australia are branching out beyond borders and looking at trading internationally. So what advice or insights do you have around tailoring content, say, on specific devices and perhaps changing the customer journey to adapt to different international markets versus just the Australian market?
Oh, Grant, what a great setup. I don't know if you know that we are just finishing some global commerce research in which we specifically we've talked to Australian consumers about their propensity to cross borders. And we've talked to U.S. consumers and to U.K. consumers as well, and that's the next round of research that we're going to be bringing out. So I'm not through looking at it, but what I can tell you is that many more people are open to cross-border shopping than are currently exercising it. For example, when we talk to folks in the U.S. and the U.K., there is a sizable group that is specifically open to Australian retailers, because we asked specifically, what countries would you be comfortable purchasing from? And Australia is definitely one of the ones that they would be very comfortable purchasing from. And so there is an open market. But then when you say, what countries have you actually purchased from, you find it's a much smaller group. So what I think we're going to be seeing in this next round of research, and we haven't done all of the analysis yet, but is that there is a much bigger market out there than people have been accessing. And the other thing that's going to happen is that it changes the way that a retailer thinks about competition, because my competition is no longer bounded by the geography that I'm in, so that people are going to be much more willing to cross borders. And so that's a plus and a minus for the Australian retailer. So you will have a much bigger market to go after. You can go after the folks in the U.S. You can go after the folks in the U.K. and other countries as well, obviously. But you also need to recognize that the reverse is going to happen, that the U.S. retailers are going to come after your market and the U.K. retailers are going to come after your market and other ones as well. So it's going to go both ways. But I would say, on the whole, given the size of the Australian market versus the rest of the world, the advantage is to Australia because you have a much bigger world out there that you can go tap and be very successful in, because there is a lot of openness and willing to cross borders. One of the other things that we're going to be looking at in that research is specifically the reasons why people are willing to cross borders, when they're willing to cross borders, what's the reason they would be willing to do that, and then what are the barriers to it, so that our retailers will begin to understand what it is that they need to do. So thank you. Whoever asked that question, I really appreciate it, because that was something that we've heard a lot about, and so we're excited. We'll be bringing you that research in a few months.
That's excellent, Susan. Well, yeah, not a setup, so a legitimate question, and great to hear that research is being undertaken, and I guess we'll look forward to hearing more from Bronto on that in the future, and hopefully via another Power Retail webinar down the track when you have those insights consolidated. Look, we will wrap it up there, and I really want to thank you, Susan, for taking the time to share all that fantastic information with us and those insights. I hope our attendees got a lot out of it today. Any questions that are still outstanding will be forwarded to Susan at Bronto, and we'll get you a response as soon as we can. So thanks again, Susan. Enjoy your evening, and I know it's evening time over there in the US, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. It's been a great webinar. Thank you for offering us this opportunity.
Great.
You have a great day.
Thank you.